A mother, consumed by grief, concealed a camera within her son's coffin, only to uncover a betrayal so chilling it defied belief. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as Denise sat motionless in her dimly lit living room. Her fingers clutched a framed photograph of Isaiah, her vibrant 17-year-old boy. Just days ago, his laughter had filled these walls. His music blared from upstairs, and the scent of his favorite midnight snacks lingered like ghosts in the hallways. Now? Silence. A deafening, unbearable silence. Isaiah was gone. A sudden, inexplicable death had torn him away, leaving Denise adrift in an ocean of unanswered questions. The official report called it natural causes, but those words tasted bitter on her tongue. Natural? How could that be? Isaiah wasn't just healthy, he radiated life. He was the kind of teenager who seemed untouchable, invincible. No medical issues. No warning signs. So how did his heart simply stop? The doctors offered no solace, their voices distant, their explanations vague. He deserved better, Denise whispered to herself. He deserved answers. As the days dragged on, her grief grew heavier, darker. Friends and family came and went, bearing casseroles and condolences, but none of it filled the void inside her. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying their last conversation over and over. He'd been so excited about basketball, about college applications, about dreams he'd never get to chase. How could all of that vanish in an instant? Then came the whispers. A neighbor, speaking in hushed tones at the funeral home, dropped a bombshell. "Did you notice the marks on his neck?" they murmured, their voice barely audible yet cutting through Denise's thoughts like a knife. Marks? She hadn't noticed them, but the comment stuck, festering in her mind. And then there was the funeral director, his evasive glances, his rehearsed responses when she asked about the autopsy. Something wasn't right. Grief began to twist into suspicion, and suspicion, Denise would soon learn, had a way of unearthing truths buried deep beneath layers of lies. But this was only the beginning, a journey that would take her places she couldn't yet fathom. The unease gnawed at her relentlessly, the neighbor's cryptic remark, the funeral director's nervous demeanor, her own gut instinct screaming that something was wrong. Every detail replayed in her mind, every interaction dissected for clues. Her first move? Calling the medical examiner's office. It took 2 agonizing days to muster the courage. Her hands trembled as she dialed, her breath shallow. The voice on the other end was polite but cold. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest? Denise repeated, her voice cracking. He was healthy. He never had heart problems. I'm sorry for your loss, the person replied, cutting her off before she could press further. The call ended abruptly, leaving her with more questions than answers. Desperation drove her next steps. She returned to the funeral home under the guise of discussing burial arrangements, hoping to catch the director off guard. But his answers remained frustratingly vague. When she mentioned the marks on Isaiah's neck, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I'm sure it's nothing out of the ordinary, he said quickly, his voice faltering. Sometimes the body changes post-mortem. Denise knew he was lying. That flicker of fear in his eyes confirmed it. Yet, the more she pushed, the more resistance she faced. Friends urged her to let go. Focus on healing, they said. Even her family began to distance themselves from her relentless pursuit of the truth. Still, she pressed on. She requested a copy of the autopsy report, poring over it late into the night. Medical jargon swirled around her, incomprehensible and maddening. Inconsistencies nagged at her, though she couldn't prove them. Each page screamed that something was terribly wrong. Her breaking point came at the wake. 2 of Isaiah's teammates spoke in hushed tones, their words barely audible over the murmurs of mourners. Did you hear what really happened to Isaiah? One whispered. I heard someone messed with him before their voices trailed off as Denise froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to confront them, but they clammed up, guilt etched across their pale faces. They wouldn't say another word, no matter how much she pleaded. But their unfinished sentence was enough. Enough to confirm her worst fears. Isaiah's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cover-up. If no one else would seek the truth, she would. Sitting alone in her kitchen, Denise stared at the tiny black device in her hand. It had arrived earlier that day, a hidden camera, purchased online. Guilt clawed at her. What kind of mother does this? But this wasn't about her. This was about Isaiah. The marks on his neck, the funeral director's hesitation, the whispered conversations, they all pointed to something sinister. If no one would give her answers, she would find them herself. The night before the funeral, she drove to the funeral home, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She'd arranged a private viewing, telling the staff she needed time alone to say goodbye. That part, at least, was true. When she entered the room, the sight of Isaiah lying there nearly shattered her. His face, once alive with mischief, now looked pale and distant. She whispered a prayer, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, before placing the camera discreetly beneath the silk lining of the coffin. Her hands shook, tears falling onto the velvet as she worked quickly. It felt wrong, invasive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Isaiah was counting on her. As she closed the lid, she made a silent vow, "I'll get to the bottom of this, no matter what." The next morning, the funeral passed in a blur of tears and condolences. Denise barely heard the preacher's words or the choir's hymns. All she could think about was the camera, silently recording inside the coffin. After the service, as guests filed out and the casket was transported to the cemetery, Denise excused herself and retreated to her car. Her fingers fidgeted with her phone, where the camera's feed was synced. She shouldn't check it, not yet. It wasn't safe. But the temptation was too great. Opening the app, her heart nearly stopped. At first, nothing, just the stillness of the coffin's interior. Then, movement. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Her breath caught as she watched the footage unfold. Someone was opening the casket. What she saw next would shatter everything she thought she knew. But she wasn't ready, not for the horrifying truth waiting on that screen. The figure handled Isaiah's body with a chilling detachment, moving him as though he were nothing more than an object, far removed from the vibrant boy Denise had loved. And then came the moment that shattered her completely. The intruder adjusted the collar of Isaiah's shirt, revealing what she could no longer deny, bruises on his neck, dark and unmistakable, like fingerprints pressed into his skin. They froze for a brief second, perhaps realizing the marks might be noticed. Denise's stomach churned as they reached into a bag, pulling out a small makeup kit. Her breath hitched in her throat. With practiced precision, they began covering the bruises. Whoever this was, they weren't just stealing, they were erasing evidence. But the horror didn't stop there. The final blow came when the figure pulled out a syringe. Denise couldn't breathe. What were they doing? Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Their movements were quick, deliberate, as they injected something into Isaiah's arm. The footage ended abruptly, the lid of the coffin closing calmly, leaving no trace of their presence. Denise sat frozen in her car, her body trembling with anger, fear, and disgust. She replayed the video over and over, hoping against hope that she'd misunderstood or missed something. But the truth stared back at her, undeniable and cruel. Her son hadn't died mysteriously, someone had tampered with his body. Those bruises weren't natural, they were proof of violence. Her thoughts spiraled back to the funeral director's nervous glances, the evasive answers, the autopsy report riddled with inconsistencies. It all pointed to something far darker than she'd imagined. Who could she trust with this? The police? The funeral home? Every option felt like walking into a trap. Yet one thing was certain, she couldn't let it go. Whatever they were hiding, she would bring it to light, no matter the cost. The footage was irrefutable proof, not only of desecration but possibly murder. Grief transformed into resolve. Isaiah deserved justice, and Denise was determined to see it through. Her first step was reaching out to a lawyer outside her immediate circle, Mr. Daniels, a seasoned civil rights attorney based in Sacramento. 2 hours later, she walked into his office, the video secured on a USB drive in her bag. The weight of her decision pressed down on her chest, suffocating. But when she entered his office, she stood tall. Mr. Daniels watched the footage in silence, his face unreadable yet simmering with restrained fury. "This," he said finally, "is beyond criminal. We're dealing with something serious here." He outlined the legal steps ahead, starting with filing a police report. Denise hesitated. Could she trust the system? She wasn't sure. But she nodded anyway. She had to believe the truth would prevail. The next day, they met with detectives at the station. Denise recounted everything, the bruises, the funeral director's behavior, the hushed whispers from Isaiah's teammates. Officer Grant, a no-nonsense detective leading the case, promised a full investigation. But as days turned into weeks, Denise realized how tangled justice could be. The funeral home denied any wrongdoing, claiming the footage had been tampered with. The medical examiner refused to reopen the case without new evidence. Then came the threats, a menacing voice on an unknown number warning her to stop asking questions. Her hands shook, but Denise refused to back down. She forwarded the call to Officer Grant, who assured her they'd trace it. Slowly, the investigation began unraveling shocking truths. The funeral home had a history of scandals, missing belongings, mishandled bodies, accusations of covering up foul play for wealthy clients. Witnesses came forward, widening the web of corruption. But the most damning revelation came from Isaiah's teammates. Under police protection, one boy admitted what they'd been too afraid to say earlier. The bruises weren't accidental. Isaiah had been in a confrontation with someone powerful, someone desperate to bury the truth. Denise's resolve hardened. As the evidence mounted, the case went public. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Isaiah's name became a rallying cry for change. Protesters gathered outside the funeral home, demanding accountability. Through it all, Denise remained steadfast. Every interview, every court hearing, every late-night call with Mr. Daniels, she faced them head-on, driven by fierce determination. This wasn't just about Isaiah anymore. It was about every silenced family, every injustice swept under the rug. She wouldn't stop until the system changed. The trial was long and grueling, filled with shocking testimonies that left Denise clutching the edge of her seat. Finally, the funeral home's owner, cornered by overwhelming evidence, admitted to years of malpractice. The intruder in the footage was revealed to be an employee following orders, to cover up signs of foul play, to hide injuries that might expose Isaiah's true cause of death. But the real breakthrough came when an independent medical expert re-examined the autopsy. The report confirmed Denise's worst fears: Isaiah hadn't died of natural causes. He had been strangled. The marks on his neck told the story of a violent struggle. The courtroom fell silent as the findings were delivered. Tears streamed down Denise's face, a mix of relief and anguish. The truth was finally out, but it had come at a steep price. Sentencing followed swiftly. Both the funeral home and those involved in the cover-up faced severe consequences. The business was shut down, its name forever tarnished by scandal and corruption. For Denise, though, the victory felt hollow. Nothing could bring Isaiah back. Still, she knew her fight hadn't been in vain. The case sparked national outrage, prompting stricter regulations for funeral homes and greater oversight in cases of unexpected deaths. Families reached out to thank her, sharing their own stories of unanswered questions and buried truths. Months later, Denise stood at Isaiah's grave, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the cemetery. She placed fresh flowers at the headstone, her fingers brushing over the engraved words, "Forever loved, forever remembered." "I did it, Isaiah," she whispered. "I promised you I'd find the truth, and I did." Her voice cracked, but strength lingered beneath the pain. As she turned to leave, a strange sense of peace washed over her, not because her grief had lessened, but because Isaiah's story had changed lives. She vowed to carry his memory forward, not just as a mother who lost her son, but as a woman who refused to let his death be meaningless. Denise's journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was a testament to love's enduring power and the lengths a mother will go to seek justice. In a televised interview, she delivered her final message: "If you've ever faced injustice, don't let fear silence you. Your voice is stronger than you think." A call to action for everyone watching, to stand up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to give up.